The autumn of 1942 was a period of dangerous operational intoxication for the German High Command, as General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army bled itself white in the ruined, dust-choked streets of Stalingrad. The strategic flanks of Army Group B were left in a state of terrifying vulnerability. Stretching over hundreds of kilometers along the winding Don River to the north and the barren Kalmyk steppe to the south, these critical sectors were held not by battle-hardened German divisions, but by under-equipped, demotivated and structurally weak Allied forces, most notably the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, the Italian Eighth Army and the Hungarian Second Army. To the intelligence officers of Fremde Heere Ost, the branch of the Army High Command responsible for evaluating enemy strength on the Eastern Front, under the direction of Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, the signs of an impending catastrophe were written clearly in the daily reconnaissance logs. By early October, Gehlen's analysts had detected a massive systematic buildup of Soviet forces in the forests north of the Don River, particularly in the bridgeheads of Serafimovich and Kletskaya, as well as in the marshy lakes south of Stalingrad. Gehlen's detailed reports warned that the Red Army was preparing a monumental pincer movement designed to slice through the Allied flanks and isolate the forces fighting inside the city. Rather than dismissing the threat, the German High Command undergoes a profound panic-induced strategic pivot in mid-October 1942. Recognizing that the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front is on the verge of annihilation, General Zeitzler manages to convince a hesitant Hitler to halt all offensive operations inside the ruins of Stalingrad. The relentless, costly assaults against the Red October factory and the Barricadi Ordnance Factory are suspended immediately, allowing the Sixth Army to transition to a rigid, defensive posture inside the captured sectors of the city. More importantly, this strategic pause frees up critical operational resources, air assets, and mechanized divisions that were previously consumed by the urban battle of attrition. The decision to halt inside Stalingrad and prepare for a defensive battle along the Don River represents a radical departure from the operational philosophy of Fall Blau. It was a recognition that space and distance had become the Wehrmacht's greatest enemies, and that the conquests of the summer of 1942 had yielded nothing but an unmanageable, overextended front line. By consolidating their forces within Stalingrad, the German leadership could establish a secure anchor on the Volga, while turning their attention to the critical task of fortifying their exposed flanks. Gehlen's intelligence reports had identified the bridgeheads at Serafimovich and Kletskaya as the most probable launchpads for the Soviet northern pincer, as these positions allowed the Red Army to concentrate massive forces on the west bank of the Don, completely bypassing the river barrier. To counter this, the OKH drafts an emergency defense plan codenamed the Don River Redoubt, which aims to transform the Allied sectors into a deeply layered, elastic defensive system backed by mobile German armored reserves. This pivot required an immense logistical and administrative effort, as thousands of tons of concrete, barbed wire, landmines, and heavy anti-tank guns had to be diverted from the Stalingrad front and sent north to the Allied sectors. It also required a delicate diplomatic touch, as the German leadership had to integrate their defensive preparations with the Allied commands, who had long complained about the lack of German support and heavy equipment. The Romanian and Italian commanders, who had been left to hold vast sectors with nothing but light infantry weapons and horse-drawn transport, reacted to the sudden influx of German material and advisors with a mixture of relief and skepticism. They knew that their soldiers, recruited largely from the peasantry and suffering from low morale, were being asked to hold the line against a massive modernized industrial army that possessed overwhelming superiority in armor and artillery. The success of the Don River Redoubt would depend entirely on whether the German reinforcements and defensive preparations could be completed before General Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky unleashed the hammer blow of Operation Uranus. With the offensive inside Stalingrad halted, the OKH immediately initiated the physical construction of the Don River Redoubt, a defensive network designed to fundamentally alter the tactical landscape of the vulnerable northern flank. Under the direct supervision of Major General Arthur Schmidt and German pioneer staff, the Romanian Third Army sector was divided into 3 deeply layered defensive zones, stretching 30 kilometers deep behind the front line. The primary objective was to replace the linear, fragile defenses with a system of mutually supporting anti-tank strongpoints, known in German tactical doctrine as Pak-Nester, or anti-tank nests. To achieve this, the Germans transferred hundreds of the highly effective 7.5 centimeter Pak-40 anti-tank guns from the 6th Army's reserves directly to the Romanian front lines, integrating them into the existing Romanian defensive positions. These heavy anti-tank guns, capable of penetrating the thick-sloped armor of the Soviet T-34 at long ranges, were arranged in deeply concealed interlocking fields of fire flanked by extensive minefields containing hundreds of thousands of telemines and anti-personnel S-mines. At the same time, the German High Command addressed the critical issue of Allied morale and tactical integration by embedding German liaison officers and specialized barrier detachments within the Romanian and Italian units. These specialized units, drawn from the German 294th and 376th Infantry Divisions, were equipped with heavy machine guns and light mortars, acting as tactical anchors to prevent panic and organize local resistance in the event of a Soviet breakthrough. To further reinforce the defensive line, the Germans constructed extensive log bunkers, barbed wire entanglements, and deep communication trenches along the high, chalky cliffs of the west bank of the Don River, using the natural defensive advantages of the terrain to maximize the effectiveness of their fire. The Italian 8th Army's sector, situated further west along the Don, was similarly reinforced with German heavy artillery batteries and tactical advisors, transforming the previously neglected Allied front into a formidable defensive redoubt. The crown jewel of this new defensive architecture was the strategic positioning of the mobile armored reserves. In this counterfactual, the Corps is fully rehabilitated, concentrated, and heavily reinforced. The elite 22nd Panzer Division, possessing over 120 operational Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, is stationed directly behind the junction of the Romanian Third Army and the Italian 8th Army, ready to launch immediate counterstrikes against any Soviet breakthrough. To its south, the 29th Motorized Division, a highly mobile and battle-tested unit equipped with armored half-tracks and heavy assault guns, is positioned as a secondary mobile reserve block. These armored reserves were instructed to avoid premature engagement, waiting instead for the Soviet spearheads to exhaust themselves against the deeply layered Pak-Nester of the 1st Defensive Zone before launching coordinated, violent counterattacks into the exposed flanks of the advancing enemy. This defensive preparation was a race against time, executed under the constant threat of Soviet air reconnaissance and local probing attacks. The German and Allied soldiers worked day and night in the freezing mud and early winter snows, digging trenches, stringing barbed wire, and camouflaging gun positions under the grey, overcast autumn skies. The logistics of the operation were immense, requiring the constant movement of ammunition and supplies along the single-track railway lines from Kharkov and Milerovo. Despite the formidable obstacles, by the second week of November 1942, the Don River Redoubt was no longer a theoretical concept on a map, but a physical reality. The Romanian and Italian soldiers, now backed by heavy German weaponry and anchored by embedded German units, possessed a degree of defensive capability that they had never enjoyed in the actual campaign, setting the stage for a dramatic and bloody collision with the massive forces of the Red Army. At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning on November 19th, 1942, the icy silence along the Don River was shattered by a deafening continuous roar that shook the frozen earth for miles. General Nikolai Vatutin's southwestern front and General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Don front unleashed a colossal artillery barrage involving over 3,500 guns, howitzers, and Katyusha rocket launchers, targeting the positions of the Romanian Third Army. Through the thick, swirling morning fog and heavy snow, thousands of high-explosive shells and screaming rockets rained down on the Romanian trenches, transforming the snow-covered steppe into a burning wasteland of mud and steel. In this alternative reality, however, the Soviet spearheads did not encounter a fragile, linear defense, but ran headlong into the deeply layered, heavily reinforced network of the Don River Redoubt. As the fog began to lift around 8 o'clock, the massive waves of Soviet infantry and T-34 tanks advanced across the white barren plain, confident of an easy victory. But as they entered the first defensive zone, they were met by a devastating, coordinated wall of fire from the concealed German and Romanian Pak-Nester. The newly installed 7.5-centimeter Pak-40 anti-tank guns, operated by experienced German crews and determined Romanian gunners, opened fire with lethal accuracy, tearing through the leading Soviet tank columns and leaving dozens of T-34s burning in the deep snow. The extensive, carefully disguised minefields funneled the advancing Soviet armor into pre-sighted killing zones, where heavy German 15-centimeter howitzers and Nebelwerfer rocket batteries subjected them to a relentless, grinding barrage. Despite the catastrophic losses, the sheer mass of the Soviet assault, driven by Vatutin's aggressive operational directives, managed to bypass several of the stubborn anti-tank nests, pushing deep into the second defensive zone and threatening to isolate the frontline divisions. It was at this critical juncture, around midday, that the German mobile armoured reserves were unleashed. Lieutenant General Ferdinand Heim, operating with a fully rehabilitated and prepared XLVIII Panzer Corps, ordered the 22nd Panzer Division and the 29th Motorized Division to execute a coordinated, pre-planned counterstrike. Utilizing their superior tactical mobility and radio communications, the German panzers struck the overextended flanks of the advancing Soviet 1st and 26th Tank Corps, which had become separated from their supporting infantry and artillery in the deep snow. A fierce, chaotic tank battle erupted across the frozen steppe between Kletskaya and Bolshoi, as the German Panzer IVs, equipped with long-barreled 75mm guns, engaged the Soviet T-34s at long range. The 29th Motorized Division, moving rapidly in their armored half-tracks, successfully cut off the Soviet supply lines and isolated the leading tank brigades, while the embedded German anchors within the Romanian units rallied the retreating troops and re-established a secondary defensive line. By the night of November 20th, 1942, the grand strategic design of Operation Uranus had been violently disrupted. While the Soviet southern pincer, under General Andrei Yeremenko, had achieved significant breakthroughs against the weak Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad, the northern pincer, which was intended to execute the primary enveloping maneuver, was locked in a brutal, grinding battle inside the Don River Redoubt. Instead of a rapid, uncontested 60-kilometer advance to the Heere River, the Soviet tank corps had been halted 30 kilometers deep, having suffered devastating casualties in armor and experienced personnel. The Red Army was forced to commit its secondary strategic reserves, including the elite 4th Tank Corps and the 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps, earlier than planned, transforming what was intended to be a swift, decisive breakthrough into a savage, localized war of attrition along the frozen banks of the Don. The tactical success of the Don River Redoubt in blunting the northern pincer of Operation Uranus fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the southern wing of the Eastern Front, but it did not provide the easy victory the German High Command so desperately desired. By halting Vatutin's 5th Tank Army along the defensive lines of the Don, the Wehrmacht successfully prevented the massive 60-kilometer double envelopment that would have trapped the entire 6th Army in a sudden catastrophic pocket within Stalingrad. There was no desperate improvised air bridge, no starving pocket at Calais-on-the-Don, and no sudden collapse of the entire front line. Instead, the Eastern Front was subjected to a prolonged savage war of attrition as the Soviet Stavka, refusing to abandon their strategic goals, poured hundreds of thousands of fresh troops and thousands of new tanks into the grinding battle along the Don River. The combat zones around Serafimovich and Kletskaya became a frozen, smoking furnace that devoured the operational reserves of both empires with terrifying rapidity. For the German leadership, the prevention of the encirclement came at a catastrophic cost. To maintain the integrity of the Don River Redoubt and support the exhausted Romanian and Italian units, the OKH was forced to continuously feed their most elite motorized and armored divisions into the defensive line. Divisions like the 3rd, 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions, which were previously intended to act as a powerful mobile reserve for the entire southern front, were instead ground down in localized tactical counterattacks against a relentless, numerically superior enemy. The German 6th Army, still holding its positions inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, was effectively neutralized, unable to launch any offensive maneuvers as its supply lines were constantly threatened by local Soviet breakthroughs and partisan actions. The Wehrmacht found itself locked in a rigid, static defensive battle of its own making, operating along an incredibly long, fragile front line that was entirely dependent on a single, overburdened railway network for its supply and reinforcement. The Soviet Western and Southwestern fronts, operating under the ruthless and efficient coordination of General Georgy Zhukov, capitalized on this static defensive commitment by exploiting their immense superiority in manpower and raw industrial output, while the German panzer divisions were slowly ground down to single-digit tank strengths. The Soviet factories in the Urals continued to deliver a steady, uninterrupted flow of new T-34 tanks, heavy artillery, and ammunition directly to the frontline railheads. The Stavka recognized that the German High Command had committed their last operational reserves to the Don River Redoubt, leaving other critical sectors of the front, particularly in the Caucasus and the central sector around Rzhev, dangerously exposed. By maintaining a relentless pressure along the Don, the Red Army systematically depleted the Wehrmacht's mobile capabilities, setting the stage for a series of secondary, devastating winter offensives that would target the deep German flanks and logistical centers across the entire width of the Eastern Front. The battle along the Don River during the winter of 1942 to 1943 transformed into a campaign of unparalleled brutality, characterized by sub-zero temperatures, constant blizzard conditions, and a total lack of shelter for the combatants on the open, wind-swept steppe. The German and Allied soldiers, suffering from severe frostbite, exhaustion, and malnutrition, clung desperately to their log bunkers and anti-tank strongpoints, knowing that any retreat meant certain death in the open snow. The Soviet infantry, heavily equipped with winter gear and backed by a relentless artillery barrage, launched daily, suicidal assaults against the defensive line, gradually wearing down the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The tactical success of the Don River Redoubt had saved the 6th Army from immediate encirclement, but it had also trapped the entire southern wing of the German army in a grinding, exhausting battle of attrition that was mathematically impossible for the Reich to win. When we evaluate the alternative scenario of the Don River Redoubt through the lens of strategic wargaming and economic analysis, we are confronted with the cold, unyielding reality that no tactical brilliance or defensive preparation could alter the fundamental strategic balance of the Second World War. The prevention of the immediate encirclement of the 6th Army at Stalingrad, while represented as a major tactical victory in German operational memoirs, was ultimately a temporary delay in a process of systemic defeat that was dictated by the unbridgeable chasm in industrial production and demographic mobilization between the Axis powers and the Grand Alliance. In 1942, the gross domestic product of the Soviet Union, combined with the colossal industrial output of the United States and Great Britain under the Lend-Lease agreements, exceeded the economic capacity of Germany and its occupied territories by a ratio of more than 4-1. This economic disparity translated directly into a crushing material superiority on the battlefield that Wehrmacht simply could not counter with tactical maneuver or static defense. The primary failure of the alternative German defensive strategy lay in the miscalculation of Soviet mobilization capacity. While General Reinhard Gehlen's Fremde Heere Ost was highly effective at identifying local troop movements and tactical concentrations, it systematically underestimated the deep strategic reserves of the Red Army, which were managed and deployed with ruthless efficiency by the Soviet General Staff. During the winter of 1942 to 1943, even as the Red Army suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties along the Don River, the Soviet state was able to mobilize and train over 1 million new soldiers, forming dozens of fresh divisions that were immediately deployed to the front. Conversely, the German war economy, operating under the chaotic and uncoordinated direction of Albert Speer and the Ministry of Armaments, was already facing severe shortages of skilled labor, coal, steel, and critical raw materials, preventing the Wehrmacht from replacing its catastrophic losses in heavy equipment and trained personnel. The loss of a single German panzer commander or experienced non-commissioned officer represented an irreplaceable strategic defeat, whereas the Red Army could absorb immense losses and continue to execute large-scale, multi-front operations. Furthermore, the focus on the Eastern Front in isolation ignores the broader global dimension of the conflict, which was rapidly closing in on the Third Reich. By November 1942, the Anglo-American landings in North Africa, codenamed Operation Torch, had opened a dangerous second front in the Mediterranean, forcing the German High Command to divert critical air transport fleets, mechanized divisions, and economic resources from the Eastern Front to reinforce the collapsing Italian and German positions in Tunisia. The escalation of the Allied strategic bombing campaign against the industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley further disrupted German aircraft and tank production, forcing the Reich to allocate significant resources to the air defense of the homeland. By committing their last mobile armored reserves to a grinding, static war of attrition along the Don River, the German leadership deprived themselves of the operational flexibility required to respond to these global threats, guaranteeing that the eventual collapse of their positions would be even more catastrophic when it arrived. In the final analysis, the historical ledger of the Second World War demonstrates that the German Empire was defeated not by a single tactical error, a premature winter, or a flawed operational plan, but by the relentless grinding mathematics of a total industrialized global war. The Don River Redoubt would have saved the Sixth Army from the immediate humiliation of the Stalingrad pocket, but it would have done so only by consuming the very forces that were required to defend the rest of the overextended German Empire. It would have transformed Stalingrad from a sudden, dramatic operational catastrophe into a prolonged, slow-motion disaster that would have bled Wehrmacht dry across the entire length of the Eastern Front, demonstrating that in the clash of industrial giants there was no defensive compromise that could overcome the absolute supremacy of mass, production, and mobilized manpower.